Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth edition of Charm Chats. So we are very privileged today to be joined by Davinia Cogan. Davinia is one of the foremost, if not the foremost, researcher of crowdfunding for energy access globally. So it's a bit of a different angle today. Rather than talking with one of our portfolio companies, we're talking with someone who really understands the industry from a different angle, and we're really honored to have you here. So thanks so much for joining us, Davinia.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Great. Well, let's kick off. So I thought we could start by just hearing a bit about you. So if you could just tell us a bit about yourself. How did you get into this and what sounds like a very niche topic of crowdfunding for energy access, and kind of what's your journey to date been?
Yeah, so I began my career in investment management, like sort of pretty mainstream investment management, worked at ING, and I was there for a couple of years. I was working full time, doing my master's in international studies, sort of knew that generally this was the direction I wanted to go in, but I'd never heard of something like social impact investing. And to cut a very long story short, the great financial crisis hit. The company I worked for was divested. I got a redundancy payout, which basically meant that I could go and do internships and fellowships and kind of figure out exactly what I wanted to do. And so I went off and did that for about 18 months. And during that time, I had a job. I was in Australia before that, and I ended up working for a social enterprise in Uganda. I worked in social impact investing when it was just kind of taking off in London. And then I did a microfinance fellowship in Tajikistan. And so I was working for Kiva, which is like a very big crowdfunding platform and one of the first. And it was at that time that I then met people from Energy for Impact, where I work now. And so I started working in the energy access sector about 8 years ago. And we started off, so I was in what was called the advisory team. So we worked with all the energy access companies, the types of companies that you lend to. And we worked with them on a number of different things. We had people on the team who were engineers. My background was finance. So I did a lot of work with them on capital raising. And it was kind of, I guess, like the most unsuccessful part of our business. We would work a lot with companies, try and get them investment ready, try and help them like with relationships with investors. And the reality was that there was just such a big gap between, the impact funds that were around then, and, where the businesses were at. And at that same time, this was sort of around 2015, peer-to-peer lending had taken off in the UK. And so the UK government was really interested in, how could peer-to-peer lending be used in more of a development context? So could it be used to finance businesses in low-income, middle-income countries as we work towards the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, which, the UK is obviously committed to. So that's when we sort of started talking to the UK government, and they ended up funding a research project through Energy for Impact, where we could research. What we did was we sort of like co-invested in the campaigns run by energy access companies, which allowed us to then develop like empirical knowledge to understand, could crowdfunding be used to bridge that financing gap faced by the companies on the ground.
It's amazing. I mean, it's a really far-reaching career that takes you all over the world as well, I think. And so it's very uniquely positioned with lots of different kind of on-the-ground experience coupled with kind of traditional capital markets knowledge. So I think it's a really exciting way that they've all kind of merged together for you. It would be great to really understand you've touched on some of this already, but how did crowdfunding really emerge then as a source of funding? And I know you already touched on Kiva, but who are the pioneers? Like, what can we learn from their early experiments, and what do we see as this sort of started to take off?
Right. So the idea of crowdfunding has been around like forever. The first project I've kind of heard of, I'm sure there were many projects before this, but the Statue of Liberty in New York was funded through crowdfunding. Of course, it wasn't online back then, but there was sort of like what would be considered today a pitch in a local newspaper, and hundreds of New Yorkers got together to fund the mount that the Statue of Liberty now sits on. And so, this has always been going on in, many countries throughout the world. It's just that probably since the early 2000s, it began to happen online, which is what we sort of now know as crowdfunding. And so I mentioned before I did this microfinance fellowship with Kiva. And so Kiva started in 2005. And it's really interesting because the two founders there, one of them, he worked at PayPal and I think also eBay. And so what he did sort of as this like proof of concept to test if crowdfunding could work, he put like campaigns on eBay. And he took like a 3-month secondment to go to India. And during that time, he had this idea, like, he was working with like local artisans there that needed money to, for working capital, essentially, so they could make the products and then sell the products, but they couldn't raise that locally. So he posted these loans, onto eBay and then got his like friends and colleagues back in San Francisco to fund the loans. And that was kind of the proof of concept for what we know as crowdfunding now. But what's kind of happened, which is, I think, where you fit in and what's kind of been most interesting over the last couple of years, like we've had crowdfunding in this social impact context being driven by microfinance. But then from about 2017, I would say, we've seen direct lending to social enterprises really take off. So you've got, the micro loans would be the individual loans for like each person that gets a solar home system, say. And that means for the social enterprise or the financial institution that's trying to raise that money, they have to enter every single borrower onto the system, write a story, like there's a huge administrative burden. And so direct lending to social enterprises is a much more efficient way to do things, where instead of giving a company, $200 for this customer, you just give them a £20,000 loan, a £50,000 loan, £500,000 loan, whatever it is, it just makes the whole process much more efficient, and companies can get on with building a business rather than having to spend all their time raising capital.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's still a need for microfinance. I think customers still need to be able to afford the money for the businesses, but I think it's a really positive development that we're seeing more lending to social enterprises. And especially, for us at Charm, we look at it as if we can grow sustainable, profitable enterprises, then we achieve the impact at scale because the companies keep doing their impactful work as well. So the two go nicely hand in hand.
Right. And particularly like at that early stage as well, when you don't have a lot of staff, like you want to be using them to grow the business, not focus on capital raising.
For sure. And for people who don't know Davinia's work, she does loads of, just going to toot her horn for a moment, but there's lots of good research out there that Davinia's published multiple papers through the Crowd Power program. And a couple of stats I'm just going to throw out there just to show kind of how the market's moved and move into maybe a slightly challenging question. But we've seen crowdfunding for energy access has been doubling year on year from 2015 to 2019. And roughly we're seeing about $150 million has now been raised through this channel in totality across multiple platforms and different types of lending. So I guess the question is, has crowdfunding for energy access transitioned from a fringe tool to a more mainstream instrument yet? And if not, why not?
Yeah, so I guess there's two perspectives here. There's like the company perspective and the investor perspective. I would say for companies, so like the borrowers that people would see on the platforms, I think crowd lending or crowdfunding has become much more mainstream. You know, like a few years ago, maybe 1% or less than 1% of the total amount raised in the sector was from crowdfunding. I think now it's more like 10%. So it's starting to become like a reasonably, at least it's counted now. Like if you look at a pie chart on the sector, it's actually in there. It used to not be in there. But then you have, I guess, like the investor side. And I'd say that's where, it's still very fringe. Like for me as an investor, if I want to, invest in an African startup, I can't just do that through any old like asset management like platform or app or whatever. I have to really go out and seek that opportunity. Right. So I think that, the people that are investing in these campaigns or these companies, they're people that really care about, we're seeing that it's usually driven by climate change or a democratization of finance in general. And so in that way, I guess it's still like quite niche. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's helpful to think of it in that way, even though it sounds like quite a large sum of capital. And I think we were discussing before in some of our prep, some of the latest figures are saying there's about $200 billion needed to actually close the energy access gap for achieving the sustainable development goals. And when you put 150 million compared to 200 billion, which is what we're targeting, it's still a drop in the ocean. But actually for the entrepreneurs receiving the capital in this innovative way and growing their businesses, it's still very, very meaningful and actually changes the companies and their customers' lives. So it's small in the grand scheme of things, and probably, I guess, to answer the question, still a bit fringe compared to what it could be, but actually still has a meaningful difference. So it's a good balance to have and a bit of perspective to share.
Yeah, and the sorts of companies like that you're working with, for example, you can't obtain finance like of that size. Like they're really like those sorts of companies are typically excluded from financing.
Absolutely.
Because everyone is kind of operating with this assumption that we're sort of at scale, and it's like, well, actually we need to build those businesses to get to scale, and then we can think about involving the whole world in it. But we really need to be doing that work on the ground to make sure we understand local startup ecosystems and build them up like in a sustainable way. So it's not just like a lot of development programs or incubation programs. They just run for like 2 or 3 years, and then it's like, okay, cool, see you later. And so the thing is, when it's done by a business, like you're around for the long term. And that's what we need, I guess, like this sort of continual strengthening of local ecosystems.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. And it sings, right to the heart of what we're doing at Charm. And it shows the kind of the gaps in the market that still can be plugged by something even as a fringe tool. So I think that's really, really, it works. It's a necessary thing to come into the industry to make the other aspects work and function as a whole system.
Right. The other thing too is that, there's such high demand from investors. Like we know 51% of investors in the UK either already hold or want to hold social impact investments. So the demand is there. It's just, about like, how do we do the work on the ground to build up the pipeline?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know it's a great kind of transition to move from the borrower focus to the investor focus for a moment of like, I know you've surveyed quite a lot of people, like what was the top thing that appeals to investors to actually make them want to invest in these projects? And then on top of that, where are we missing more opportunities for engagement? Like where are the gaps that still we think need to be filled to engage a wider audience?
Right. So as we were talking about microfinance crowdfunding. So we've sort of gone from microfinance related crowdfunding to this direct lending. So we've seen a real shift in the type of investor that engages. So under sort of the micro lending crowdfunding model, the average investment size is sort of around like £20. Like it's not a lot. And our take on that, and based on the research we've done where we've surveyed investors, is that about the majority of people that are putting money into these campaigns, they're not earning interest, and it comes, I think, from their sort of donation purse. But once we started examining those that are investing in these campaigns that are direct loans, and they also earn an interest rate, the average investment size jumps to about £500 per investment. And people are investing in multiple campaigns also. And so within this cohort, we did a survey of about 1,000 investors that had already invested in an energy access campaign specifically. And what we found was, we asked them about their motivations. We gave them 12 different options to understand. Overwhelmingly, the number one response was, this investment aligns with my personal values. And so I think that people are really looking for opportunities. I guess, the rise of the conscious consumer, we're sort of, we want to buy products that are perhaps, made more sustainably, and that extends to our investments. And so the number one motivation is alignment with values. And then the next three were quite closely clustered, and then sort of the remaining 8 motivations were very, very low. But it went in this order, which I think is quite interesting. So it went alignment with values, then it went environmental impact, social impact, and then financial return. And so I think the important thing is that, financial return is important, but it's not the be all and end all. People are looking for alternatives, ethical investments, that this need or this desire is just not being fulfilled by the traditional asset management sector, which is, I think, is why investors are coming to platforms like yours. Yeah,
great. And I guess, that sounds, it proves a lot through actual research of how we're seeing the retail investors looking at impact investing as a whole, and that alignment with values, and kind of the fact that financial return is 4th. It says quite a lot, but it also says of 12. So it is still important. They're still considering it an actual investment, which I think is an important distinction to draw, rather than just, oh, well, if they repay, they repay. If they don't, I've done some good. But actually, it is important to see that it is still considered an investment, not charity. And I think that's key for that growth trajectory as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so where are there gaps? Where are we missing people for engagement? Who should we be talking to that we're not talking to yet?
So I guess, one is that pipeline development. We need to be building the pipeline. We've done some pretty interesting experiments with our program at Energy for Impact. So, we did this survey. We found that about 70, probably slightly more than 70% of investors were men. But we've also found, so the research, I guess, outside of our sector shows that there's very high demand from millennials for impact investments. And basically, age and desire for impact investments are inversely correlated. So the younger you are, the higher your desire for impact investments. And so we've done a couple of experiments where we've worked with different platforms to, test different outreach, like marketing strategies, to try and get different groups to engage. And so I think, that's one of the areas, how do you engage more women? How do you engage millennials? How do you engage, any specific group that you're looking at? How do you do that? And how do you apply a very private sector lens to that, and run experiments and test what works, and then use that to scale up, to build your investor base, hopefully at the same time as also building up your supply, so that those two meet. Because I really do genuinely believe that there is such high demand for impact investments. And I think it's shown in the research, 51% of people have them or want to hold them. And I think that's just going to continue to grow.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it's a good point because it's kind of matching maybe traditional things of just the user experience, traditional marketing to find the people. So it's kind of how do you match that demand for it with the accessibility? And I think it's kind of a traditional challenge to kind of quite a new idea to get everyone involved, which maybe is a good thing as well, because it means there's tried and tested paths to follow.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think the importance of this sort of blending of, we're doing social good, but with all of the tools that have helped the private sector to grow.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
they can be leveraged for good as well.
For 100%. Yeah. No, it's great to hear, and I think it shows the potential growth, which leads me on to my kind of next question. But anyone, if you have any questions, please do pop them in the chat, and we'll open up to questions shortly. If not, I've got loads of questions for Davinia, so I can always pick her brain. So don't worry if you don't. But if you do have any questions, please chuck them in. So I guess kind of leading on from what we were just saying, how do you see kind of crystal ball moment? How do you see energy access and crowdfunding fringe access growing over the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years? And what do we need to do to make that growth happen? So really crystal ball moment, but what does that look like for us, and where do you see it moving?
Yeah, right. So I think like the first bit probably important to acknowledge is COVID. And so, from 2015 to 2019, we saw 100%, like an average of 100% year on year growth each year. So we went from sort of like $2.5 million US raised in 2015. I think it was about 100, getting up to sort of 100 million by 2019. It was about 65 million, I think, in 2019. So that, 100% year on year. In 2020 dropped, contracted by 25%. So, and we would have, I think, expected to have seen growth somewhere between 50 and 100% in 2020 otherwise. So I think, probably the next year or two will really be about recovery, about, getting back to where we were in 2019, but also getting not just in numerical terms, like in growth terms. I think, that's a really important milestone to kind of get back to that 50 to 100% growth rate.
Right.
And then I guess the other part of this, like as it scales, is that I think it's important to make the investment products more and more attractive to crowd investors. So we do research with things like guarantees, like understanding what's the impact of an investor guarantee on the amount that people invest, or even just their reason for investing. We've found actually that generally doesn't impact their decision, but it does impact the amount that they contribute. So I think, yeah, sort of this, innovation of the actual products that are offered on platforms. As I kind of alluded to before, at the moment, the process is a little bit clunky. Like you sort of hold your normal investments over through one app, and then you have, another app for your these sorts of investments. And I think, as crowdfunding platforms grow, there'll be more opportunities to perhaps offer instruments that maybe like pool a group of borrowers into one security that can be purchased by investors, which really like sort of takes, I guess, the work out for the investor, that you can sort of invest, just sort of once rather than having to do it 10 times, if that makes sense. And then I think, I guess it's like if you're pushing so much on the demand side, I mean, we can't forget the supply side, because that's actually one of the biggest challenges that even currently platforms face. And I think that requires two things. Is like one is, having like the incubation programs in place that really like do build up those startups. But I think at the same time, we need to like shift our mindset a bit. Like I do when I speak to some investors, I often hear, oh, there's like a dearth of investable companies. And I just wonder if like the lens for some people that are conducting due diligence is really the right lens. And perhaps, if you don't have enough diversity within your due diligence teams, you're missing out on so much, because you have your like traditional due diligence process, which I am not reducing at all. I think that's very important. But you also have like social knowledge and the sort of, the knowledge that you get through just networking and being on the ground and having local staff that, have, and even like staff, that have been part of these incubation programs and have been working with companies for 2 years, 3 years. Like they know the business and they know the person. And at the moment, I see quite like a Eurocentric view of what an investable company looks like. And there's not enough leveraging of like what's going on the ground. And that really comes back to, I think, the people and having people on the ground who are so embedded in the local entrepreneurial ecosystem that they're able, to do that work, to find the companies and grow those companies. And so, the more companies we can get on platforms that are even just borrowing 10, 20,000 pounds, like they're going to then graduate and be able to borrow 100, 150, 500, 1 million, 10 million, and so on. And that's really what we need to get to reach, the universal energy access, which is the goal for 2030. But yeah, I think, we need to kind of work on both sides, the supply side and the demand side.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think it's a great way to wrap up. I think we've got a couple of questions we can hopefully answer relatively quickly, but I think to touch on your point, there's the other side, which is kind of, it's both on the creating the right tools for assessing companies, but then it's for investors to be looking at a market with the lens of what's the actuality of the risk and not just their kind of preconceived notions of what the risk is based on country level indicators or something, rather than understanding the actuality on the ground. So I think it's a great piece for us all to kind of take away and challenge ourselves on. Okay, we have 3 questions that have come in and we have 1 minute. So we're going to whiz through these if we can. Okay. One of them, I apologize if I pronounce your name wrong, but Shanta, how do African companies fit into crowdfunding platforms when they often have to be in the jurisdiction of the country where funds are being raised? I can probably answer that very quickly and say, Shanta, just drop me an email and we can talk through this in more detail. But it depends on the platform. Generally, for what their requirements are and the legal structures, and often they'll help you set up a separate entity where needed, but it does depend on each platform. But please feel free to email me directly and we can talk about that one in more detail. The next question was around one of the statistics you mentioned, Davinia. So it was the 51% of investors with interest in, they've used the term ESG, environmental, social and governance, that were, almost missed it, we got there, that were mentioned. Are they related to the UK market, that statistic, or was it the European market?
Yeah, so that's for the UK, and 20% of the 50, so the 51, 20% of people held social impact or impact investments, and 31% of people were interested in holding impact investments.
Brilliant. And I think something maybe for a conversation of another time that Davinia and I discussed before for everyone's relevance is how crowdfunding as a tool, at the very least, the regulation in the EU is shifting to make it far more available across the European Union. And so the rise of crowdfunding as a route for ESG, impact investment, everything else we think is going to really change, and the competition landscape will shift. We'll have to save that for another time. Yeah. The final question, which I think is a good way to wrap us off, and I'm sorry that we're running over by a couple minutes, hopefully people can stay. This is from Sanjoy asking around the local ecosystems and questioning how should incubators in Africa help incubatee companies develop crowdfunding strategies?
Oh God, that's a big one. Big one, I'm out of time. Yeah, I mean, I think so. Number one thing I think is running incubation programs that don't just go for 2 years. I think you need to have programs that go at least for 5 years, and they need to adapt as companies mature. So it can't just be an incubator that's you know, great for a pre-seed company or seed company. It needs to be able to provide access to finance. It needs to provide, you know, the sort of like the engineering, the technical type support as well. Yeah. And so I think, yeah, having this like more holistic and long-term incubation is really what's needed, rather than like a, yeah, I mean, some of these incubation programs go for 3 months, and like maybe that's good for like quickly upskilling, but it's not great for building a business long term.
Great. Okay, well, we are out of time, but I'd like to say a big thank you to Davinia. We might have to do a round 2 at some point to go into some of these topics in more detail. But this was great, really insightful, and really I learned a lot as well, which is always nice. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you everyone who attended. Please do sign up to our socials, which Adam has very kindly just popped into the chat. So stay in touch. We're going to be doing more of these in the future. So please check us out, follow us online, and looking forward to seeing you guys at the next Charm Chats. Thanks again, Davinia, and thanks everyone for dialing in. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
No worries. Thanks. Bye.